lot of literature about the amount we spend on different diseases. And in a very substantial paper that was produced in a notable medical journal in 2012, the authors, I think, wisely compared the impact of smoking and physical inactivity on mortality. They asserted that the levels of smoking and inactivity were similar. Both contribute about 5 million deaths per year globally. 5 million from smoking, 5 million from physical inactivity, and that's about the 36 million deaths that can be attributed to chronic diseases worldwide. So they both have a similar contribution to mortality within our population. What's interesting is the prevalence of inactivity worldwide is much lower than in Northern Ireland, so the relative contribution is probably higher in our country. However, we only spend a fraction of our budgets promoting physical activity or providing opportunities for physical activity compared to smoking. And so I think we need to reassert our policy priorities towards away from some of the more traditional approaches in public health to what we are seeing as a strong evidence to promoting and providing opportunities for physical activity. So the question remains is, well, why are we inactive? What can we do about it? So if we understand the reasons for inactivity, then we can begin to deal with some of those. And they're numerous. Usually we start off thinking about the individual barriers to regular physical activity. And no doubt there is a biological factor at play in here. Mr. Wells commented on the relative contribution of genetics. Genetics probably contributes about 40% of the overall story in terms of mortality, and about 60% comes from behavioral patterns. So biology doesn't account for it all. Yes, the fitter we are, the more we can participate in some of the high-end activities. But it's not the only story. Probably the more interesting story and the more relevant story is psychology. Knowledge of the benefits, knowledge of how much activity we should be doing, which is poorly known in Northern Ireland. Attitudes to activity, thinking that it's a good thing for me, and also the social cultural factors, making activity, regular activity, a cultural norm. Mr. Wells gave a very nice example of an individual who chose to drive the 20 or 30 feet between shops. And that is a cultural norm for us to drive between venues here. But that's not true in every country. And if you visit some certain Northern European countries, you'll find that the norm is to take a more active mode to travel between places. So does tackling some of these individual factors work? In another review where they compared various approaches of tackling physical activity to see how effective they might be. Now, the dotted line across the middle is the line of no effect. So if your intervention falls there, we usually say that's of no real benefit. You may not be able to see the details, but towards the left-hand side are more of the psychological interventions, tackling things like self-efficacy, or the belief that I am able to make changes in my activity and perform regular activity. And we see a relatively small effect size from those kinds of educational interventions or psychological interventions. Towards the right, you'll see the one that stands out, second from the right, is pedometers. This is a small device that attaches onto your waist. And what you do is you ask someone to record their activity so you increase their awareness of how much they do, and then to set goals. We have a long history of pedometer research in Northern Ireland that has been exemplified throughout the world. And we have shown that it is possible to get people to change their activity using pedometers over a period of time. And both universities have been involved in showing the health benefits of that. However, the effect sizes are probably still quite small. And I'd put to you the effect sizes are probably quite small because the individual factors that predict the activity are only one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is the environment in which we live. You see, as we assess the environment that we currently live in Northern Ireland, we can clearly see an over-reliance on cars. Our occupational activity trends have changed, where we're now reliant on computers and technology within work. And if we go into most homes, there's also a reliance on electronic entertainment for our recreational behaviours. So our transport has changed, our occupational activity has reduced, and our recreational opportunities have reduced. So what can we do about it? Well, let me introduce the concept of walkability. This came from a planning perspective where planners went, there are actually features of where we live, the neighbourhoods in which we live, that can influence our physical activity. And they coined the term walkability. Walkability is a measure including a number of factors. And let me outline one or two of them. One is which is residential density. Living in a higher residential density, people who live there are more active. Partly related to the ability to choose to go to places, because they're usually places that have a high intersection density or connectivity of streets. So if you can imagine a classic suburban house in which many of us live at the end of a cul-de-sac, of which we have only one choice in the direction in which we might walk, which is out towards the main road, and most of us probably would choose not to walk along that main road. Contrast that with an inner city, say apartment block, which is high residential density, and we've got lots of choices of where we can go. When we come out of our front door, we can go left or right or straight or behind the building. So intersection density is related to physical activity. And other factors like land use mix, the amount of the land apportioned to different types of development, and also net retail area. So having shops and facilities and workplaces near our home mean we're more likely to travel to and from them. Let me convince you this from the data. People who live in more walkable neighbourhoods, and by walkable neighbourhoods, when we've assessed this in Belfast, are largely those inner city kind of neighbourhoods, the neighbourhoods that weren't planned by our modern planning service, in fact, but that predate that. And that those who live there are more active, irrespective of social class, or in this case, income. Now, I didn't talk about inequalities in physical activity participation, but one of the big ones is, as we see in many health-related behaviours, is in social deprivation. And so irrespective of income, living in a walkable neighbourhood will improve your health. My second assertion to you, ladies and gentlemen, is not only would increasing physical activity benefit us across society in our multi-sectors, but it is the responsibility of multi-sectors to deal with the growing pandemic of physical inactivity as it relates to Northern Ireland. This is not a health issue. Health do not have responsibility for planning, for building control, for road design. And so I would suggest that that the other departments who are beginning to realise this need to take urgent action on this. I quite like this informative graphic from colleagues in San Diego in America who've pulled together some of the evidence into a compelling argument. Living close to trails or facilities where you can walk or cycle mean that 50% of us are more likely to meet the physical activity guidelines. There's no education in there, that's merely just living close to the opportunity. But opportunity isn't the only thing, because it has to be an opportunity that we may want to avail of. And therefore, walkable communities are twice as likely to meet their activity. Having recreational facilities that teens would want to use are probably also 50% more likely to meet their recommended level. We were involved in a global charter for physical activity, which I'm sad to say our government hasn't signed up to. And part of this global charter, Toronto Charter for Physical Activity, was 5 key things that governments would commit to promoting physical activity. And I want to introduce 3 of them to reinforce my point. One is that we need to introduce policy that supports physical activity across multiple sectors. And I've just tried to highlight that from different examples so far. Number 2 is that we need to implement a national policy and action plan for physical activity. We have a number of cross-sectoral, cross-departmental policies at the moment which relate to specific chronic diseases like obesity, and I know there are others in the pipeline. However, I would suggest that we need one particularly focusing on physical activity, because it is not just a health issue, but much wider societal benefits can be accrued. And the only way to take forward an action plan that might result from that national policy would be a partnership approach. So no longer, I think, is it acceptable for us to work in our silos, and transport and health and DSD and others work in their own little bits of the country, but that we should work together, because it's only through those cross-sectoral working that we can begin to initiate the interventions that are required to change these worrying levels of physical activity. That's the background, a little glimpse of what we've done in Northern Ireland. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ruth Hunter, who will describe some of the interventions that we are doing in these areas.
Okay, folks, so just to summarise really what we've heard so far, we know that physical activity levels in Northern Ireland are low, and we need to do something to change that. We've also heard a summary of the evidence base that really highlights the many benefits of physical activity for health, for society, and also for economy. However, previous interventions have had only modest effects, with maintained changes in physical activity being difficult to achieve. We therefore need to rethink our approach to public health interventions if these physical activity recommendations are to be realised. So previous efforts have mainly targeted individual level factors associated with inactive lifestyles. Recent guidance published in January this year from NICE have highlighted 3 main components or behaviour change techniques that all interventions should include, not just for physical activity, but also for other health behaviours. These include self-monitoring and feedback. So as Mark mentioned, the likes of wearing a simple pedometer to measure a number of steps per day and getting feedback on that, on the amount that we're doing. Also goal setting and also social support. So that includes our family, friends, work colleagues, and also, which is coming more into play now, online forums and social media. However, most of these individual level interventions are notable for their limited ability to sustain behaviours beyond the actual time frame of the intervention. This may be because they actually omit to intervene in the actual social or physical environment context in which these behaviours occur. So we argue that there is a need to move beyond these individual level approaches towards broader population level behaviour change by providing both supportive social and physical environments. So research being conducted locally is aiming to address these gaps in the evidence. So one example is some of the work that I've been leading in the development of a physical activity loyalty card scheme, which was piloted at Stormont Estate here with just over 400 civil servants. So using a similar approach to well-known high street loyalty cards, where users can earn points for minutes of activity, and those points can then be reimbursed for rewards, which were retail vouchers sponsored by local businesses. So this individual level intervention was tailored to both the local and social environment context. So for the physical environment, sensors were placed, which is in the photograph here, around footpaths in the gym and exercise studio to record minutes of physical activity by simply swiping a little credit card, which was a loyalty card, at these sensors, which recorded timestamps. Maps were also provided of local walking routes where these sensors were placed, again tailoring the physical activity behaviour to the workplace context. In terms of social support then, online forums were encouraged through our study website, where participants could set up their own walking groups with colleagues. And from the swipe card data, we can infer social networks. So we've done some analysis looking at the work colleagues who were walking with others, and from that analysis, we can see that people who actually tend to walk in groups of 2 or more actually stayed longer in the intervention and completed more minutes of activity than those who tended to walk alone. So social support is important. Another unique aspect of this study was that the retail vouchers were sponsored by local businesses. For financial incentive schemes such as this to be worthwhile in the longer term and also to be implemented on a large scale, they must be based on a sustainable business model.